All right. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another virtual program here at the Old Baldy Foundation, commemorating National Lighthouse Day tomorrow. We have a big treat this afternoon. I've been looking forward to the day when we can bring author and historian Kevin Duffus on board for one of our virtual programs. And today is the day, and I hear he has quite a present for the Old Baldy Foundation in honor of National Lighthouse Day tomorrow. So you and I know Kevin Duffus first by authoring our 2017 book, The Story of Cape Fear and Baldhead Island. And I got to share with you my favorite book of Kevin's is The Last Days of Blackbeard. I'm a little bit on a pirate fix. And I think I was first introduced by Kevin because he is the gentleman that discovered what happened to the Cape Hatteras Fresnel lens after the American Civil War. And this is the third edition that we sell here in the gift shop of The Lost Light. Personally, I'm really thankful. Kevin is always willing to share his knowledge. He's a wonderful mentor. His passion is so infectious, and I'm just really honored that he shares so much of his time and so much of his knowledge with the staff here at Old Baldy. So recently, Kevin has been researching the architectural lineage and the roots of Baldhead Island's original lighthouse, the lighthouse that predates Old Baldy. And he recently is going to be publishing in the Coastal Review an article about Henry Long, who is Baldhead Island's first lighthouse keeper, North Carolina's first lighthouse keeper. And this Friday, I'm happy to share with you all that the National Lighthouse Museum up in Staten Island is going to be honoring Kevin with their Lighthouse Research Award. It's going to be this Friday, and I'll share details when we conclude today on how you might tune in and watch Kevin receive that award. So congratulations, Kevin, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Travis. It's a great thrill for me to participate.
Great. So during our conversation, folks, if you're out there listening, drop us a line in the comments. I have my phone going on right here. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what your connection is to Baldhead Island. And if you would like to send a message to Kevin or a question to Kevin, I'll read them out to Kevin during our interview here. We already have one, Phil. Phil is a board member at the Southport Historical Society, a treasurer, and a great volunteer. And he says, greetings from Southport. Hope all came through the storm okay. We sure did, Phil, and we're glad to hear that you're joining us. So, Kevin, our education staff, our volunteers, are presented with this unique challenge on Baldhead Island. This idea that we're trying to interpret 3 lighthouses and only one stands. And the idea that folks are having to use their imagination when interpreting the first lighthouse and Cape Fear Light Station, you can imagine the difficulties, the challenges, and the confusion that happens. So would you, briefly describe this original lighthouse and perhaps compare and contrast the original lighthouse with Old Baldy that people are familiar with?
Sure. Well, I would begin by saying that the 1794 Cape Fear Lighthouse, not only Baldhead Island's first lighthouse, but North Carolina's first lighthouse, and also the 1817 Baldhead Lighthouse were significantly different, even though they were both octagonal towers. Yet at the same time, those 2 towers were very much the same. I say that because Old Baldy was constructed using as many as 350,000 to 600,000 bricks from that original tower. That alone is a rather remarkable statement among American lighthouses, maybe even exclusive to Baldhead, a lighthouse inside a lighthouse. Furthermore, both lighthouses were crowned by the same iron lantern, which was recycled from the first tower in 1813 and placed atop Old Baldy 4 years later, where it remained until 1849. Now, we can get into more specific ways the 2 lighthouses were different in terms of their architectural designs and lineage, but In terms of size, Old Baldy, with a diameter at grade level of 36 feet, is about 4 feet wider than the 1794 lighthouse. And as a point of comparison, the first Cape Hatteras lighthouse that was built in 1803 was just 28 feet 4 inches wide at its base. So it was much narrower than the original Cape Fear lighthouse. Now, the masonry walls of the 1794 tower were 4 feet 6 inches thick for their first 20 feet, compared to walls 5 feet thick for the first 20 feet of Old Baldy, or roughly up to the first landing. Now, the thickness of the walls in 1794 caused a lot of consternation and nervousness among the federal authorities, because they didn't think that the 1794 tower was built substantially enough. But we can get back to that in a little bit. Now, as a point of comparison, the 1803 Cape Hatteras lighthouse had 6 foot thick walls, and the oldest surviving lighthouse in the United States, the New York Harbor Lighthouse, established in 1764 at Sandy Hook, New Jersey, had walls that were 8 feet thick. So the Cape Fear lighthouse, the original one, was 99 feet 3 inches tall, measured to the top of its dome above the lantern, and it was the nation's tallest lighthouse at the time that it was completed. The first Cape Hatteras lighthouse, built a few years later in 1803, was 105 feet at the top of the dome, so it became the nation's tallest lighthouse until Old Baldy was built. And then during Old Baldy's first 60 years or so, prior to when it was reestablished with a 4th order lens and a smaller lantern in 1879, Old Baldy originally was 115 feet to the top of its dome. So when it was completed, it surpassed the first Cape Hatteras lighthouse as the nation's tallest. And how long it held that distinction, I have yet to figure out, but I will soon, because it was the tallest lighthouse for some time.
We have no doubt you're going to get to the bottom of that. And this is so really exciting. We talked about this together a few weeks ago, and it never particularly crossed my mind to tell folks that the original lighthouse and Old Baldy were at some point or another the nation's tallest lighthouses. And that's remarkable, because I think folks really just automatically go to Cape Hatteras. Their minds, when they think the tallest, goes to Cape Hatteras, and that's where it stays. And they don't even consider to think about Old Baldy and the original lighthouse. So that really, since we had that conversation and you brought this to light, that's really had some jaw-dropping moments out in the field here at Old Baldy Lighthouse.
Great.
We have lots of folks listening. So Logan is a great volunteer at the Old Baldy Foundation, one of the first folks I met. Yeah, you know Logan. Yeah. Says, hi, Kevin. Thank you for all that you do in the preservation of the memories of North Carolina's lighthouses and maritime history, specifically our Old Baldy. My mom is watching, Kevin. And Natalie, greetings from Georgetown, South Carolina. Natalie, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Natalie. Glad you're with us.
And John Havel, he's trouble, I hear.
Yeah, brilliant man, and a great researcher in his own right.
Absolutely, the one of the authorities on Cape Hatteras up there, and we're so glad John, Naida have or support us here at Old Baldy. They're great friends, the Old Baldy Foundation. And Frank Newton, who's a really great supporter and friend and a descendant of one of our lighthouse keepers, has joined us once again. Hey, Frank. Chuck Hughes, another supporter, love the stories of lighthouses. Oh, and I have a message, Kevin, here from John. It says, hi, Kevin Duffus. Great stuff. Always learn so much new stuff from you and your research. Thank you. And thank you, Travis. And Kara is listening. Kara is, Kevin, the supporter that bought us this microphone, which has really helped us
out. I've appreciated that microphone myself.
So let's get back to this lighthouse. So you were kind of doing a really great job of comparing and contrasting Old Baldy, which people are familiar with, and this original lighthouse that we have to use our imagination. But let's dive a little bit more into depth of the original lighthouse, its construction and its design.
Sure. And Speaking of depth, make sure you ask me later about the Lighthouse's foundation, because I forgot to talk about that. But actually, North Carolina's first lighthouse has been elusive for historians, just as it was for many mariners trying to find the Cape Fear River or avoid frying pan shoals. These questions have come to mind. What were the lighthouse's dimensions? Who was the builder? What was the source of its light? In fact, my friend and mentor, the late David Stick, who was the author of the seminal book, North Carolina Lighthouses, wrote that many records that he had access to fell short of providing many of those answers. And what led me down the rabbit hole in search of answers that no one else had ever found was a 223-year-old letter in the National Archives, a copy of which is in the collections of the Smith Island Museum. And I read that letter for the first time 5 years ago while I was conducting research for the book, The Story of Cape Fear and Bald Head Island. And that document was a handwritten advertisement that had been sent out in January of 1793 from US Revenue Commissioner Tench Cox to several customs collectors, mostly in Northeast states, seeking recommendations for a qualified building superintendent to complete the unfinished lighthouse on what they called Cape Fear Island. According to Cox, construction of the tower had begun a few years earlier under the authority of the newly formed independent state of North Carolina and its appointed commissioners for the navigation of the Cape Fear River. Sometime after the lighthouse had reached an elevation of 46 feet, according to Tench Cox, the unidentified builder died. And within that letter, Cox listed the tower's specifications. He wrote, quote, "You should be further informed that the building is an octagon of 32 feet in diameter at the surface of the earth, that it is on a foundation 4 feet deep, that it is 4 feet 6 inches thick for 20 feet 3 inches from the earth, to which height the walls are perpendicular, and it then assumes the form of a pyramid, which it will retain through the remaining height of about 64 feet to the place where on the lantern floor will be laid," end quote. Well, when I read that for the very first time, I was absolutely stunned. Vertical walls for the first 20 feet of an octagonal tower? Initially, I didn't think that I had ever seen such a design in a colonial or federal era lighthouse, except vaguely I recalled that maybe I had. Well, first, I closely examined that famous woodcut illustration of the waterspout in the mouth of the Cape Fear River. If the lighthouse had a square base or vertical walls for its first 20 feet, then it must have been hidden behind the wax myrtles and cedars and live oaks in the foreground of that drawing. Well, that was very frustrating. And so after an excruciating period of time trying to remember where I had seen a similar lighthouse, it finally dawned on me. It was an illustration from April 1861 in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper of the Charleston Lighthouse on the eve of the Civil War. In fact, it was published the very weekend that the war began. It appeared to be an octagonal tower built upon a 20-foot high square base, just as the Cape Fear Lighthouse was described by Tench Cox. But a historian doing their due diligence needs multiple sources of evidence. So I wondered, could I find an illustration somewhere depicting Cape Fear's square base? And I did. I succeeded after many hours of searching. I found a map created in the late 1790s by surveyors Jonathan Price and John Strother. I'm sure you've all seen it, titled "A Map of the Cape Fear and its Vicinity from Frying Pan Shoals to Wilmington." This map has been praised for its high degree of accuracy, and the map depicts the Cape Fear Lighthouse located on the extreme west point of Bald Head Island, standing atop its box-like first story. It suddenly became apparent that the design of the Cape Fear Lighthouse may have been based on Charleston's lighthouse.
Yeah. That's great. I know there's a copy of that map in this house right now as we speak. It's informative and decorative, and of course, how ironic that a tornado came through Bald Head Island just a few days ago, and that's exactly that wood, at least the woodcut or the pen and ink in our drawing that you were referencing. And I encourage folks to visit oldbaldy.org. Many of these primary resources that Kevin has been discussing for us are accessible via our website, our digital archives, including that depiction that you were just speaking of about the tornado. So we have plenty of other listeners. Andrea Williams and Stephanie Preston is listening, Sharon Dorsey, Laura McCullough, lots of folks joining in this afternoon. So thank you and welcome, folks. So you're diving into this connection with the Charleston Lighthouse. And I want you to just elaborate a little bit more on that and tell folks how when you first presented me with this research, you said, oh, and just wait till you hear, not only does it go back to Charleston, it goes the whole way back to England. So elaborate on this, folks, because they're probably thinking, what? Just like I was.
Sure. Well, when I began to put all this together, I first had a problem. When I began reviewing these published sources for the history of Charleston's lighthouse, I encountered a bewildering hodgepodge of historical interpretations, contradictory descriptions, conflicting facts and dates. Even the National Register of Historic Places nomination for Charleston Lighthouse was full of erroneous information. You would think that Charleston's, as much as they have the pride that they have in their history, they would have had that all pretty correct, but no, that's not the way it was. In fact, many sources said that the lighthouse with the square base in 1861 was built only 4 years earlier. Or other people said that it was maybe built in 1837, or another source said it was built in 1801. And probably the most authoritative book on South Carolina lighthouses stated that the original Charleston lighthouse, built in 1768, was completely destroyed in the War for Independence. But if that were true, I wondered, why would the lighthouse depicted at the start of the Civil War in Charleston have shared the same distinctive square base of the Cape Fear Lighthouse, which was built in the late 1780s? It didn't make sense. And it took me 3 years of research and analysis to write an article for the U.S. Lighthouse Society's quarterly magazine, proving that there was only one Charleston lighthouse prior to today's Morris Island Lighthouse, built in 1876. The lighthouse with the square base marking the entrance to Charleston Harbor on the eve of the Civil War was the original 1768 lighthouse. It was indeed damaged in the Revolutionary War, but only at the top, at the lantern. The square base survived that war unscathed. Next, I had to reconcile the difference between the illustration of the Charleston Lighthouse in 1861 in the newspaper and the Cape Fear Lighthouse in the waterspout picture. Now, in the waterspout image, the lighthouse, this is the published waterspout image, the lighthouse had 4 windows in a column on one side, which was unusual among octagonal lighthouses, including Old Baldy, where I know you know these octagonal lighthouses had fewer windows and they wrapped around the tower at the various landings. Next, I examined the original hand-drawn pen and ink drawing upon which that published woodcut was created, that Chris Webb had so kindly photographed for me. I pestered her to death at this time because I needed to get a copy of it. Of course, it's featured in the book on the history of Cape Fear and Bald Head Island. I discovered a conspicuous difference between the original drawing and its published reproduction. The sculptor of that woodcut chose to include only 4 windows on a single side of the lighthouse. Maybe he was lazy. I don't know why they did it that way, but in the original sketch, there were 4 windows appearing on 2 different faces of that 8-sided building. In fact, the very same arrangement of windows appeared in the 1861 illustration of the Charleston Lighthouse. And that window configuration was entirely unique to those 2 towers among all of America's lighthouses at that time. So then I went back and reread Tench Cox's letter describing the work that remained to be done to finish the Cape Fear Lighthouse. In 1793, when he wrote that letter, 46 feet of the tower had already been completed, a little more than half of its final height. Tench Cox wrote, quote, "The carpenter's work also to be executed will consist of 8 windows of 24 panes." Well, 8 windows had already been framed in the first 46 feet of the tower. So then I realized that the completed lighthouse would have had 16 windows total on 4 faces of the octagonal structure all around. Likewise, Charleston Lighthouse too must have had 16 windows. So this was a clue that led me to the remarkable discovery of the architectural pedigree of both those lighthouses, an octagonal church steeple. So I learned that the architect of Cape Fear's sister lighthouse at Charleston was a man named Samuel Carty of Dublin, Ireland. And soon after emigrating to South Carolina in the mid-1750s, Carty received a commission to be the master builder of St. Michael's Church at the corner of Broad Street and Meeting Street, which was completed 10 years later. Samuel Carty also designed the supremely elegant 185-foot tall octagonal steeple of St. Michael's Church, which he then placed atop a very massive square base, just like both lighthouses at Charleston and Cape Fear. Now, church steeples were what Carty specialized in, so he naturally designed his lighthouse at Charleston with a steeple, like a steeple, with windows on four sides. And so my research led me even further back in time to discover that Carty's inspiration for the square platform supporting the octagonal steeple of St. Michael's Church was Scottish architect James Gibbs's St. Martin in the Fields Church in London that stands today on Trafalgar Square. Consequently, it can likewise be said that North Carolina's first lighthouse at Cape Fear was also based on St. Martin in the Fields. So I want to remind you and all of our viewers today that even though neither the 1794 Cape Fear Lighthouse or the 1768 Charleston Lighthouse have survived the ravages of time, and we can't go visit them, we can still stand in awe of those lighthouses' architectural inspirations at Charleston or London. And I hope some of you do that someday. Look up at St. Michael's Church and you'll see the base of the original Cape Fear Lighthouse.
I tell you, if I'm ever in Charleston, I'm an Episcopal for the day just to go to that church.
Yeah.
And I think that the Charlestonians would approve of you describing it as supremely elegant. That seems very Charleston-esque.
And you know, yes, and it's too bad that the Charleston Lighthouse was actually intentionally destroyed at the beginning of the Civil War in December of 1861, because Samuel Carty's steeple at St. Michael's Church survived the 1886 Charleston earthquake, and maybe that lighthouse, had it not been destroyed in the Civil War, would still be standing today. So that's unfortunate.
Very unfortunate. It amazed me as I was learning more and more content over the years, how many lighthouses were the sites of active terrorism or war, not only during the American Revolution, but during the American Civil War as well. Absolutely. And I know Morris Island, do you know anything about any future preservation efforts? I know that's one of the most endangered lighthouses in the nation.
Yeah, they're making, there is a foundation that is working to save that lighthouse, which is entirely surrounded by water now. And I pointed out to the folks in Charleston that a similar occurrence that caused erosion of that island, Morris Island, is similar to what happened with the original Cape Fear Lighthouse. So we know that that the opening of New Inlet, of course, accelerated erosion on South Beach. When the Corps of Engineers decided to channelize the entrance to Charleston Harbor, it completely changed the hydrography of that area, which accelerated erosion at Morris Island. So that lighthouse today is entirely surrounded by water. But they've made great progress in stabilizing that lighthouse, and they're hoping to be able to eventually, I believe, build a revetment around it and turn it into an island of its own.
Well, that's very reassuring to hear, and I'm so glad you brought up about the connection between what is happening there and the ultimate demise of our original lighthouse, because this is a constant learning curve. Being in my role here at the Old Baldy Foundation, and sometimes I don't get everything right. I beat myself up for it when we get things wrong. And most of that is the result of these perpetuating myths. And one that is just rampant in this area is the fact that the river changed course, and the river was the ultimate demise of our original lighthouse. when in fact it was not the river, it was basically the ocean as the result of this new inlet being created by hurricane, 10, 13 miles north of Bald Head Island. And you really helped me work through that. I'll give other folks another aside is you're a great teacher, Kevin, because you didn't give me the answer about the windows. You made me go back and count on each of the published version and then the original pen and ink drawing, and you let me come to my own conclusion on that.
Good.
And the inlet was the same way. This idea that it was the river, or that it was not the river, it was in fact the ocean. You really helped me work through that material and stop perpetuating that myth at the Old Baldy Foundation. So I want you to tell our audience, how do you begin deconstructing myths? And is there a lot of backlash when you prove a myth wrong that has been sustained in an area, in a community for years and years and years?
Well, that's a terrific question, Travis, especially if the answer that I hope to be able to give you serves to inspire future history detectives, because that's what I'm all about, is that if there's someone who learns one little thing from what I have to say, then I consider it a success. But as far as deconstructing myth, or as I would actually say it, challenging a longstanding historical interpretation, it's as simple as questioning everything that you read. Ask the questions: does this ring true? Does it make sense? Is the statement supported by irrefutable facts and impeachable sources? When was the interpretation first formed, and by whom, and for what purpose? So for me, to be a conscientious historian and interpreter of historical events, I have to do three important things: exhaustively research primary sources or original sources. Naturally, I mean, that's where you always start. But most importantly, and I think this is often forgotten, I spend countless hours analyzing that research in order to understand and construct inferences about what most likely happened in the past, and then to pass on that knowledge to my readers using words to paint pictures. I strive to take them with me back in time to be observers or eyewitnesses of what happened. A lot of our history is unfortunately written by cut and paste historians who simply rewrite what others have previously written without doing their own original research. Cut and paste historians perpetuate historical errors and myths over and over and over until the historical interpretation is, in the minds of the public and even pop culture, permanently sculpted in stone. I sometimes refer to these quasi facts as historical kudzu. I think it overwhelms the more interesting truth, kind of like kudzu does in an old farmhouse on the side of a highway. And historical kudzu is impossible to eradicate. So for me, I mean, research is like piecing together a massive jigsaw puzzle, but the historian never has the benefit of being able to see the puzzle's completed picture on the cover of the box. And most of the puzzle pieces aren't even in the box, but are scattered far and wide in archives and libraries and in attics and family Bibles, on cemetery headstones. I have, in fact, found history on cemetery headstones, and also in the ancient deed books of county courthouses. And then making the historian's job even more challenging is that among the few puzzle pieces in the box are false ones that have been misshaped by poor scholarship. So to answer your question, the historian using original sources has to sort all of this out, root out and analyze the errors or origins of the myth, explain how they came to be, discard the misleading puzzle pieces, and then reconstruct the story based on new facts. In fact, I've recently been fond of saying that research is a scavenger hunt while riding a roller coaster that rarely has an ending, but is always full of surprises. But I do have to say that it's really, really fun and rewarding solving a long-standing mystery. Now, you asked is there a backlash? Well, there's not been a backlash like you would imagine. When a good research historian has done their due diligence and is confidently able to show why long-standing historical interpretations are false, there is no backlash or counter arguments from other historians, only silence. They simply ignore historical revisions like they don't exist. And on that subject, I'm very curious to see what will happen next year, which will be the 500th anniversary of a Spanish slave hunting mission in 1521 that arrived at a bay on the future Carolina coast that became known as the River Jordan, and the land surrounding it as Chicora, because North Carolina historians have long believed that the Cape Fear River was the River Jordan of 1521, even though there's absolutely no evidence to support that. At the same time, there is convincing contradictory evidence that the River Jordan was almost certainly South Carolina's Winyah Bay estuary at Georgetown.
It's and you've got, it will be curious to see how that is interpreted in the popular mind and with popular historians as well. There's a wonderful chapter in the story of Cape Fear about those explorations and kind of deconstructing that myth. And on the same light, Verrazano, you did a great job in one of the early chapters of the book as well, kind of deconstructing some of the myths surrounding Verrazano. And we definitely, you're right, we face those myths or these long-standing historical interpretations daily here at the Old Baldy Foundation. And we're really glad to be working away from the cut and paste history.
Well, I finally remember when I had completed the first few chapters of the book, I sent the first drafts to Chris Webb and Kim Gottschall, and I think they were a little concerned that the entire book was going to be simply tearing down long-standing historical beliefs, especially with Verrazano. But I knew I had to address that issue because, you know, it's pretty clear that Verrazano did not make his landfall at Cape Fear. And I've enjoyed the benefit of having been a sailor. In fact, I have sailed from the Caribbean to Wrightsville Beach and technically made landfall near Cape Fear. So I know what it was like. I know what those waters being out there, crossing the Gulf Stream. I know what all that was like. But clearly Verrazano's landfall was probably in the vicinity of Murrells Inlet. But nevertheless, we have a development in Wilmington, of course, known as landfall. But that's not the worst historical misnomer that I've ever come across. There was a very famous aircraft carrier called the USS Kitty Hawk, which is probably the only US Navy warship ever named after a telegraph station, because the Wright brothers didn't fly at Kitty Hawk, they flew at Kill Devil Hills. And to get their message out, they actually had to go up to Kitty Hawk to send it. And there's a great example of people not really researching history thoroughly enough, because they should have named the aircraft carrier the USS Kill Devil Hills if it was going to be named for the first powered flight.
Yeah, that's great stuff. And I blame Pembroke Jones for landfall here in Wilmington. And you got to promise me the next time you're sailing from the Caribbean to Wrightsville Beach, please take me. I'd be a good mate, you know?
Sure,
And
absolutely.
I don't know which place I like better, the Caribbean or Wrightsville Beach. They're both great. We have got quite a few comments here, Kevin, I'm going to read out. Andrea Williams is saying she loves learning about the lighthouses. And Nicole is listening. David Brown is listening up from Wilmington. Hey, David. Jane and Laura. Dawn Taylor from up towards Cape Hatteras. She says hello, Kevin. And Norma. John has a comment. John Havley says, wow, looking at photos of St. Michael's and Charleston, amazing research, and what a fabulous and twisted tale of our history. And he's also agreeing, yes, I find terrible facts every day in all the most common and popular places. So John echoing our comments there. April's listening, and Jane and Karen and Natalie from down at Georgetown is saying, is that Cape Hatteras framed over Kevin's right shoulder? He made great DVDs of the move.
Yep, that's it. That's the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse.
That's great. Kevin, which is are you allowed to have a favorite lighthouse in North Carolina?
Um, I suppose so. I mean, I don't know, but
Which is it?
I would have to say Old Baldy. I mean, to write the chapter about Old Baldy and Sedgwick Springs, Chris was very gracious. Chris Webb was very gracious to allow me to go into the lighthouse by myself one evening, about the time that the lighthouse keepers would have gone in to go up the stairs to light the lighthouse. And I spent quite a bit of time in there, and I felt like I wanted to absorb. There's incredible history inside that building, inside those walls. I mean, the same is true of Cape Hatteras, but Old Baldy is very special. Is that a politically correct answer?
Hey, you're getting brownie points for me because I get in trouble that saying Old Baldy's not my favorite lighthouse. It's Ocracoke. I love Ocracoke. So, so you're making my job easier. Dawn had a very similar experience. She came down last February and was able to not only go inside where her ancestor, Devaney Jeanette, lived out at Captain Charlie's by herself. It was wonderful, but she also got to go inside Old Baldy by herself and spend a few quiet moments. So that it must be really, really powerful. I think of that when I'm in there, particularly at sunrise. Sunrise does it for me. Don says, yeah, Old Baldy, sacred ground. So on terms of National Lighthouse Day and our favorite lighthouses, what is the original lighthouse's role in this legacy of National Lighthouse Day? Because we often don't have time on our tours to discuss this idea that North Carolina started construction of this original lighthouse, and the federal government had to come behind and finish it. It's so challenging as someone in the field that you are condensing such dense material and content, and I want to discuss everything, and my tours never finish on time. Never finish on time. And what yeah. So it's very frustrating to miss out on that moment. So what do you think the role is of this legacy of the original lighthouse in terms of National Lighthouse Day?
Well, very well yesterday. The first city passed 7th of August. And I agree with you that it's sort of odd that we National Lighthouse Day in Carolina, because the state had yet ratified the U.S. Constitution.
So, folks, I think Kevin lives in the mountains. In that the irony that this coastal historian lives up in the North Carolina mountains. So we're going to wait on Kevin to come back on here, and he will get back on. I think he just had to turn his camera off there a minute, and we'll pick up this on the other side. Just as a reminder that tomorrow is National Lighthouse Day. And as Kevin was just discussing, and we discussed on a program yesterday, National Lighthouse Day commemorates the 9th piece of legislation ever passed by the first Congress of the United States. And that National Lighthouse Act federalized the nation's lighthouses. And I knew Kevin would get there. Kevin, thanks for joining us again. I was just explaining to folks the irony that this coastal historian lives out in the mountains. And that's why we are working with y'all to bring you this video. And it happens here at Bald Head. It happens out in the mountains. Sometimes you just don't have enough internet bandwidth.
Right. Yeah. Can you hear me now?
You sound great. You sound
okay.
Great. So I described to folks what National Lighthouse Day was, or reminded. So continue with this legacy of the original lighthouse and its contribution to National Lighthouse Day.
Sure. So it's important to remember this fact that, especially with regard to the first lighthouse at Cape Fear, and because I believe the construction probably began or was well underway by 1789 and perhaps as early as 1787. So when I wrote the book, The Story of Cape Fear, there were two questions regarding the first lighthouse for which I could not find answers. When exactly did the construction of that lighthouse begin, and who was the initial builder? We know the second builder was Abishai Woodward, but we've never been able to come up with the name of the first builder. And I can now definitively answer one of those questions and closely approximate the answer to the other. So it was just last week, and I was hoping to give Old Baldy Foundation and Old Baldy a present for National Lighthouse Day. And so I was doing some new research, and I came across a letter to Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton from Wilmington, North Carolina, dated the 18th of April, 1791, from a Matthew Lyle. His last name was spelled in the letter L-Y-A-L-L, but it could have also been spelled L-Y-L-E. So Lyle wrote to Hamilton, quote, "Since the lighthouse, which I contracted to build here, has been ceded to the United States, and the funds provided by the Assembly for that purpose having ceased, that further prosecution of the business properly comes within the department of your office." He's basically asking Hamilton, for money to be able to continue the construction of the lighthouse. He said, he continued in the letter, "The building, which ought to have been finished a long time ago, is not yet completed. And at this time, I find myself in a very unhappy predicament, not being able to quit the works with justice to myself, nor can the Cape Fear commissioners make me compensation, so that until some measures are effectively taken, I must remain in suspense and at a very considerable expense." So from that document, I learned a few things, not the least of which was that the writer, the builder of the lighthouse, was very well educated. But first and foremost, we learned the name for the first time of the initial builder of North Carolina's first lighthouse, the name Matthew Lyle. And so with that, another piece of the puzzle falls into place. I love putting those little pieces of the puzzle, and we'll never have all the pieces, but we're beginning to see a more clearer picture of history. So as I mentioned earlier, we know that from the Tench Cox letter or advertisement that the initial builder had died after the tower had reached a height of 46 feet. But the question is, when did Matthew Lyle, the builder, die, and what caused his death? So upon discovering his name in his letter to Hamilton, I searched for other records pertaining to Matthew Lyle, but I was only able to find one, an estate filing in New Hanover County on the 27th of August, 1792. So Lyle died about 16 months after he wrote that letter to Alexander Hamilton, when he described that the lighthouse should have been finished a long time earlier. Unfortunately, I still don't know how he died, but it almost certainly wasn't on the job, because I don't think any construction was going on during this time. And after considering this for many, many hours since last week, I've concluded that it was probably very unlikely for the state of North Carolina and for the commissioners of the Cape Fear River navigation to have proceeded with the construction of the lighthouse after the state ratified the Constitution and joined the Union. They certainly would not have spent any of their own money to continue construction, knowing that the expense of building and operating the nation's lighthouses had been taken over by the US Treasury. Therefore, by November 1789, I believe that the first 46 feet of the tower had already been built by Matthew Lyle. And furthermore, I think it would have really been unlikely for North Carolina to have continued funding the construction of that lighthouse after the state had ceded on the 14th of December, 1790, the 10 acres of land that the lighthouse stood on. So this pushes the possible start date of the Lighthouse Foundation and its first 46 feet of the tower even farther into the even earlier into the 1780s. In fact, as I've said, my best guess is that the construction of the lighthouse probably began about 1787. And so now we can better understand why it took so long, nearly 8 years, to build North Carolina's first lighthouse, because it took place in the midst of the enormous turmoil for our fledgling nation as it transitioned from a confederation of independent states to the United States federal government, with all of those political battles that had ensued during that time.
Absolutely. It is quite a present to have that name, Matthew Lyle. And we are sniffing the trail. We're joining the hunt. We're going to be scouring the local historical societies around the Lower Cape Fear and learn more about this man, because this is a huge contribution. This is a huge piece of the puzzle. And I'm just so excited. I've been sitting on this for a little while. I may have shared it with one other person or two other person, but kind of holding on to this secret. And I've been really excited to share this with everyone today during this interview, because this is huge, and it just shows how thankful we are and how gracious that we have someone like Kevin Duffus on our side, who's helping us, show the way to get a better picture of this misinterpreted and misunderstood lighthouse. So really exciting stuff, and it takes place during one of my favorite eras in American history. I'm not much of a Hamilton fan. I'm probably might be a little of an anti-federalist, but I always will support lighthouses. so, um, so now we have Matthew Lyle, and we have him. We have the name, and we're starting to go down that trail to uncover the mystery behind the man. There's someone else in this story that you've been doing a great job putting the puzzle together for us, and that is the original lighthouse keeper, this gentleman named Henry Long. And I know that something is going to be published in the Coastal Review. Has it been published yet, Kevin? I haven't seen anything yet.
No, didn't appear right before we went on, but it should be coming out, Coastal Review online, today or tomorrow, because they wanted to publish it in time for National Lighthouse Day.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure to share that on our Facebook page as well when it comes out. So tell us, there are only like 16 lighthouses or so, lighthouse keepers at the time of this original lighthouse. So this is quite an exclusive club that Henry Long is a member of. And I'd love to hear more about what you've learned about Henry Long, Kevin.
Sure, and I don't know how much time we have, but that obviously the article in Coastal Review online will have much more detail. But so Bald Head Island and I always say North Carolina's first lighthouse keeper too, Henry Long began his life in Germany as Heinrich Lang. His family emigrated to Maine in the 1750s. In fact, in the article, I speculate that their ship, is after it left Portsmouth, England, probably saw the Eddystone Lighthouse, which I personally have flown around in a helicopter. But I think that might have planted the seed of lighthouse keeping in Heinrich Lang's mind. But so they moved to Maine, but eventually relocated to the German settlement of Bethabara near today's Winston-Salem. But they went by way of the Cape Fear River. And we can deduce that Lang, by then, he was 28 years old, chose to go no farther than the lower Cape Fear region. In fact, the native of Germany's Westerwald Hills must have found a liking for the sands and salt marshes and healthy breezes of Cape Fear, like so many people since. So Heinrich Lang assumed the anglicized version of his name, Henry Long, and took a wife named Rebecca, and he began a new occupation as a river pilot. And circumstantial evidence leads us to conclude that Long had made friends in high places, because you can imagine his skilled river pilots had great opportunities to do so as they were guiding ships in and out of the Cape Fear River on their way to New York or Philadelphia. So Long probably became a very trusted friend of the increasingly influential Hooper family, led by Harvard graduate and Wilmington attorney William Hooper. In fact, I know you all know Hooper was later one of North Carolina's 3 representatives to the Continental Congress, and he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. In fact, his image painted in that famous painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, he's in a very prominent position. You should take a look at that. So a few clues tell us that Henry Long must have served his young nation honorably, because in June of 1794, he was nominated by the Commissioner for Navigation, George Hooper, who was William's brother, to become the first keeper of North Carolina's first lighthouse. And this was a coveted federal position generally bestowed upon deserving war veterans and also the politically well-connected. And so George Washington's approval of Long's appointment came at an annual salary of $300. Now, Long had appealed for $350 a year, but the new keeper was also offered the valuable bonus of a good house, which quote, supposedly was well situated for taking fish and piloting. But when you read the article, you'll find out that poor Henry Long never had time to go fishing nor piloting. He was spending all his time tending to the lighthouse.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're looking forward to that article. So Henry Long, he serves here, and he is one of these characters in the story of Bald Head Island that meets a tragic end. Unfortunately, we have so many tragic endings out here. And I think that folks will be very curious about some of the ominous events leading up to Henry Long's tragic demise. Can you kind of set the scene for us of what is happening in the weeks leading up to Henry Long's death?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, there were two very ominous events in 1806 that presaged the tragic death of Keeper Henry Long. The first is very familiar to enthusiasts of the lower Cape Fear history, because it was on the 24th of July, 1806, that ink black clouds spawned that nightmarish swarm of 11 waterspouts that churned the mouth of the river, barely missing the lighthouse. The famous woodcut and the hand-drawn illustration only show one waterspout, but there were 11 waterspouts that day. And I'm sure everyone, of course, obviously have seen that illustration. But then on the 22nd of August, the storm that became known as the Great Coastal Hurricane made landfall at Cape Fear, and it was described by the editor of the Wilmington Gazette as the most violent and destructive storm of wind and rain ever known here. And even though ships in that storm were driven ashore and many people were killed, the Cape Fear Lighthouse and Henry Long's family somehow survived, apparently unscathed. That's a great example that the history has often said that that lighthouse was poorly built, but as I've reminded you, that lighthouse survived for many years, from 1794 until it was dismantled in 1813, including this terrible hurricane. But then 2 months after that hurricane, the unthinkable happened. But first, I'll go back a couple of years. A couple of years earlier, Henry and Rebecca's daughter, Elizabeth, had suffered an untimely death, leaving her husband, Southport pilot Joseph Swain, with 2 young children. And for reasons that we still don't know, Joseph Swain became unable to support his family, and he moved over to Bald Head Island to be sheltered and fed at his father-in-law's lighthouse keeper's house. And perhaps in order to do his part to put food on the table, on the 16th of October, Joseph Swain went out to hunt deer and wild hogs from a blind in the thick forest on the island. And at dusk on that day, after spending most of the day waiting for his prey to pass without any success, Swain was about to return back to the keeper's house when he heard a rustling sound in the bushes about 25 yards away. And fearful that he might miss an opportunity to return home to his family with something to eat, he hastily cocked his musket and fired. But instead of shooting a deer or a hog, Swain was sickened to discover that he had shot his father-in-law in the abdomen. Henry Long, who was a young boy on his way to the New World, was almost certainly influenced by seeing a lighthouse, died almost instantly. Notice published in the Wilmington Gazette 5 days later reported the tragedy, quote, "The circumstances attending the demise of this respectable old gentleman are truly distressing," end quote. And thus was ended the life of North Carolina's first lighthouse keeper, yet his light was somehow kept alive.
I like that, Kevin. You've got a way of telling a story. That's sure. It's a terrible demise. It's going to be happening often as Bald Head Island's history comes towards the present. And what a beautiful way to describe the last few moments, or last few months at least, of Henry Long. So to wrap this up, why is this original lighthouse? Why is Henry Long? Why are they worth remembering? What is this original lighthouse and this original keeper, what are their contributions to the story of Bald Head Island?
I'm so glad you asked that question because, frankly, our history would be incomplete without telling the story of that first lighthouse and its first keeper, even though both, of course, are long gone. That 1794 lighthouse was not just Bald Head Island's original lighthouse, it was North Carolina's first lighthouse. And it, along with its older sibling lighthouse at Charleston, shared an extraordinary architectural design based on one of the most beautiful and historic church steeples in America. Hundreds of thousands of that lighthouse's bricks are inside Old Baldy Lighthouse today, and making that tower also distinctive among American lighthouses. And I think about this, that some of those bricks may have actually lined the interior walls of that 1794 tower and were touched by the hand of North Carolina's first lighthouse keeper, Henry Long, and his wife, Rebecca, who for a few months continued to serve as the keeper of that lighthouse before she was replaced by Sedgwick Springs. And I wonder if perhaps some of those same bricks are caressed today by the hands of countless climbers of Old Baldy. So even though that 1794 Cape Fear Lighthouse is a lost light, it still stands metaphorically as a navigational marker of our history, guiding us on a voyage of discovery of North Carolina's early years as a state, of our nation's Constitution and its Bill of Rights, and of the ideals of the Federalists and the principles of their opponents. North Carolina's first lighthouse can help us steer our way into learning about architecture and geography, economics, and even the rights of women. 1794 Cape Fear Lighthouse is a shining beacon of Bald Head history, North Carolina history, and American history.
There you have it, folks. That is why we are fans of Kevin Duffus here at the Old Baldy Foundation.
Thank you.
Couldn't have said it any better. Kevin, thank you so much for spending a few, an hour here this afternoon with us. I'm looking forward to continuing this dialogue with you. I appreciate your mentorship and your knowledge and your passion, and how generous you are in sharing all those things with us here at the Old Baldy Foundation. We have
Thank you, Travis, and I want to thank Chris Webb and also the board of directors of the Old Baldy Foundation. It's a fabulous and a very well-run organization. I'm very proud to be associated with you all.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. Lots of thanks on the comments. Greg Thatcher and Frank Newton, Natalie, they're all saying, beautiful and eloquent. Thank you. Natalie's asking, were those bricks ever from ballasts in ships?
No, I don't. No, they were purposely made for the lighthouses.
Yeah, and Natalie, it's great. The receipts are not only are they published in the book, at least one of them, they're also on oldbaldy.org. You can see the receipts for the bricks that were shipped here from Philadelphia. And Frank Newton, one other question, he says, was the Federal Point Lighthouse built after the start of the construction of Old Baldy? We believe so, but they were almost simultaneously built. And that is the original, the first of the three Federal Point lighthouses up the way. Well, folks, just to wrap up here, you can purchase some great titles by Kevin in our virtual gift shop at oldbaldy.org. It's a great way to continue to learn about the history of Bald Head Island and North Carolina's maritime history. And it is additionally a great way to support the mission of the Old Baldy Foundation while we remain closed for climbs due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And as just a reminder, anything that you'd want to know about Bald Head Island's history is here, The Story of Cape Fear and Bald Head Island. We have many more titles in that online store, The Lost Light, The Last Days of Blackbeard, War Zone. You can find those books, those titles, on our virtual gift shop at oldbaldy.org, or stop by the gift shop, which is open for operations Monday through Saturday, 10 to 4, and Sundays from 11 to 4. Tune in tomorrow. We are going to have a special message from all of North Carolina's lighthouses in commemoration of National Lighthouse Day. If you give us 7 minutes, you're going to be able to visit every single one of North Carolina's lighthouses and learn just a little bit about each of those, since we're all still closed for climbs due to the pandemic. And then on Saturday is our annual duck race. Tune in, watch perhaps on Facebook. We'll get it up here on Facebook Live for you. And there's still an opportunity to purchase a duck for our annual duck race, again, at oldbaldy.org. So Kevin, thank you again for joining us. Many more comments here. John Habel saying, wonderful interview and excellent dialogue by two wonderful historians. Thank you. And thank you, John. Kira is saying, if history teachers had the way with words, if history teachers had these way with words, we would have many more people well educated about the history of our nation and our world. Nina says, so interesting, love history, left just before the hurricane. And Frank is replying to Karen, say no doubt there. So I think that's a great way to end this. So thank you again, Kevin, and we will continue this discussion real soon.
Okay, great. Thanks, Travis.
Take care, everyone. Thanks for joining us.